Imagine the same patient, with the same fever, seen by 6 different doctors across 750 years of British history. A medieval physician checks the color of his urine and cuts him to drain bad blood. A Renaissance doctor does exactly the same thing, but can now draw you an accurate diagram of the vein he just cut. A Victorian doctor operates on him without washing his hands, then discovers, too late, why that was a catastrophe. A modern doctor takes a blood test, reads his DNA, and prescribes a drug built for his specific illness. Same patient, same fever, completely different answers, 7 centuries apart. That gap and everything that closed it is Medicine Through Time, the single biggest thematic study on the GCSE syllabus, said in some form by nearly every exam board. This video covers the whole timeline: causes of disease, how people tried to prevent it, how they tried to treat it, and how public health changed medieval superstition to modern science. Let's start where the syllabus starts. For most of the medieval period, medical theory rested on an idea that was already ancient: the Four Humours, inherited from the Greek physician Hippocrates and refined by the Roman doctor Galen, whose word remained almost unquestionable for over 1,000 years. The theory said your body held 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Stay healthy, and those 4 stayed in balance. Get sick, and one of them had overflowed. It was logical, consistent, and taught in every medical school in Europe. It was also, we now know, completely wrong. But here's the exam point that trips people up. Medieval people were not stupid for believing it. It fit everything else they understood about the world: the 4 seasons, the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, water. A wrong theory that explains everything is far more convincing than a correct one that explains only some things. That single idea, the Four Humours, would shape how British doctors treated patients for roughly 1,500 years. If illness meant too much of one humour, the treatment was obvious: get rid of the excess. Bloodletting used a blade, or leeches, to drain blood believed to be overflowing. Purging used laxatives and made you vomit, to clear out excess bile. Physicians examined a patient's urine against a colored chart, matching its shade to a diagnosis, sometimes without even seeing the patient in person. And medicine was never purely medical. The church dominated medieval life, and dominated healing too. Monasteries kept the era's best hospitals, tending the sick as a religious duty, growing herbal remedies in their gardens, and copying ancient medical texts by hand, which is largely how Galen's ideas survived at all. Prayer, pilgrimage, and religious ritual sat right alongside bloodletting as legitimate treatment, because illness was widely believed to be a punishment from God or the work of the stars. Exam boards call this supernatural causation, and it existed in parallel with natural theories, not in place of them. In 1348, a disease arrived in Britain that made the Four Humours look hopelessly small. It came by ship, along Mediterranean trade routes originating somewhere in Central Asia, and it moved through England with terrifying speed. Victims developed swollen, blackened lumps called buboes in the armpit and groin, high fever, and in the worst cases, in what modern historians call the pneumonic form, bleeding from the lungs that could kill within a day. Contemporaries simply called it the Great Pestilence. We call it the Black Death. Modern science tells us it was almost certainly the bacterium Yersinia pestis, spread mainly by fleas living on black rats, though historians still debate the exact transmission and how a pneumonic form could have spread person to person through the air, without the fleas at all. Whatever carried it, it killed on a scale nobody living had ever seen, and medieval medicine, built to explain a bad diet or an unlucky season, had absolutely nothing that could explain or stop this. With no accurate cause, people reached for every theory they had, and the exam boards want you to sort these into natural and supernatural because both were tried at once. The leading natural theory was miasma, the idea that disease spread through bad-smelling, corrupted air. So people carried sweet-smelling herbs, burned fires to purify the air, and rang church bells, believing the vibrations might cleanse it. Doctors advised avoiding baths, believing warm water opened the pores to let bad air in. Supernatural responses ran alongside this: processions, prayer, and most strikingly, flagellants, groups who whipped themselves in public as penance, convinced the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sin. Some towns did stumble onto something that actually worked without understanding why. Early forms of quarantine, isolating the sick, restricting travel between infected areas, which genuinely slowed transmission, even though nobody involved understood germ theory. Right cure, wrong reason is a pattern you will see again and again across this entire topic. The scale is difficult to overstate. Historians estimate the Black Death killed somewhere between a third and a half of England's entire population within about 2 years, a death toll no war in British history has come close to matching. Whole villages were abandoned completely, their populations too depleted to continue, and some of those deserted village sites can still be traced in the landscape today. And it reshaped society, not just medicine. With so many laborers dead, survivors found their labor suddenly dramatically valuable, and wages rose sharply as landowners competed for workers, a shift so significant it eventually helped provoke the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Medically, though, the impact was smaller than you might expect. The disaster did not trigger a scientific revolution. Doctors mostly concluded their existing treatments simply hadn't been applied hard enough, more bloodletting, more purging, rather than questioning the theory itself. Real medical change was still 200 years away, and it would come from an entirely different direction: the printing press. By the 1500s, Europe was changing in ways that would eventually reach medicine. The printing press, invented around 1440, meant medical ideas could spread faster and more accurately than hand-copied manuscripts ever allowed, and crucially, could be checked and challenged by more people than ever before. The Renaissance brought a new intellectual attitude too, a willingness to question ancient authorities instead of simply trusting them, and a growing belief that you should observe the world directly rather than just reading what long-dead Greeks and Romans had written about it. The Church's grip on official knowledge began to loosen, very slowly, and dissection of human bodies, though still controversial and often illegal, became more possible for the first time in centuries. This is the world that produced two men the exam boards treat as turning points, not because they cured anything, but because they proved, for the first time in over 1,000 years, that Galen, the untouchable authority, could simply be wrong. Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish anatomist working in Padua, Italy, did something startlingly simple. He dissected human bodies himself, in person, rather than relying on old texts or watching from a distance while an assistant did the cutting. And what he found didn't match Galen at all. Galen, it turned out, had built much of his anatomy on dissections of animals, pigs, dogs, and Barbary apes, because dissecting humans had been largely forbidden in his own time. Vesalius proved, among other errors, that the human jawbone is a single bone, not two as Galen claimed, and that the liver doesn't have 5 lobes. In 1543, he published his findings in a beautifully illustrated book made possible by the printing press, showing the human body in detailed, accurate diagrams. The importance here is not the jawbone itself. It's what it proved, that a foundational authority, unquestioned for 1,300 years, contained real, demonstrable errors and could be corrected through direct observation. That was the genuinely revolutionary idea. Nearly a century later, William Harvey, an English physician, overturned another of Galen's core ideas. Galen believed blood was made continuously in the liver, burned up as fuel by the body, and that the two sides of the heart were connected by invisible pores. Harvey, dissecting animals and calculating the sheer volume of blood the heart pumps in an hour, realized those numbers made Galen's theory impossible. The body couldn't possibly manufacture blood that fast. In 1628, Harvey published his discovery. The heart is a pump, and blood circulates around the body in one continuous, one-way loop through arteries and veins. It was a genuine scientific breakthrough, built on careful measurement rather than guesswork. But notice what it didn't do. It didn't cure a single disease. It didn't change how a single sick patient was treated. Doctors kept bleeding and purging patients exactly as before, because understanding how blood moves is not the same as understanding what causes illness. That gap between new knowledge and old practice is the whole story of this era. This is the point in the topic where students most often get caught out, so hold on to it carefully. Understanding the body's structure did not translate into better treatment for another 2 centuries, and the exam boards test this continuity relentlessly. Vesalius corrected the anatomy textbooks. Harvey corrected how blood moves. Neither man identified what actually caused disease, because nobody yet had any concept of germs, of microorganisms too small to see. So a patient walking into a doctor's surgery in 1650 received almost exactly the same treatment as one in 1350, bloodletting, purging, herbal remedies, and prayer, just now delivered by a doctor who could draw you a far more accurate diagram of the vein he was about to cut. Better science, same treatment. It's a pattern that repeats constantly across this whole period. New knowledge and old practice can coexist, sometimes for generations, before anyone works out how to turn the discovery into an actual cure. And Britain was about to be tested by exactly the same enemy, all over again. In 1665, plague struck London again, in what became known as the Great Plague, killing an estimated 100,000 people, close to a quarter of the city's population, in about 18 months. And here's the striking part for the exam. The medical response had barely moved on from 1348. Doctors wore the now famous beaked masks, stuffed with sweet herbs, still working from miasma theory, still believing bad air was the enemy. But the authorities' response had sharpened considerably. Londoners were required to report plague deaths. Victims' houses were sealed shut with the whole family locked inside for 40 days, a red cross painted on the door as warning, and mass burial pits were dug outside the city walls. This was public health as raw state power, harsh, often cruel to the healthy family members trapped inside, but it represented a real shift, the beginnings of organized government action against disease, even while the underlying medical theory remained exactly as wrong as it had been 300 years earlier. The Great Fire of London, in 1666, arguably did more to end it than any doctor. By the 1700s, one disease terrified Britain above all others: smallpox. It killed roughly a third of everyone it infected, and scarred or blinded most who survived it. One partial defense already existed: inoculation, deliberately infecting a healthy person with a mild dose of smallpox itself, taken from a patient's sore, in the hope their body would develop resistance and survive a lighter version of the disease. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who had seen the practice used in the Ottoman Empire and carried her own smallpox scars, brought inoculation to fashionable British society in the 1720s, and it did work, dramatically reducing death rates among those brave or wealthy enough to try it. But it carried a serious danger the exam boards make sure you understand. A person inoculated with real smallpox could still die from the procedure itself, and worse, could spread full-strength smallpox to others nearby while they carried it. Britain needed something safer. A country doctor in Gloucestershire was about to find it in the udder of a cow. Edward Jenner, a country doctor, had noticed local folklore that dairymaids who caught cowpox, a mild disease picked up from cattle, seemed to never catch smallpox afterwards. In 1796, he decided to test it properly. He took matter from a cowpox sore on a milkmaid's hand and inserted it into a cut on the arm of an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps, the son of his gardener. The boy developed a mild fever, then recovered. Weeks later, Jenner did something that would be utterly unthinkable and illegal today. He deliberately infected James with real smallpox to test whether the cowpox had protected him. James did not develop the disease. Jenner named his technique vaccination, from vacca, the Latin word for cow. Crucially, unlike inoculation, cowpox itself posed almost no danger to the patient and could not spread smallpox to others. It was safer, and it worked. And it worked without Jenner understanding why, because germ theory was still 65 years away. He had found a cure with no theory to explain it. You might expect a safe cure for a terrifying disease to be embraced instantly. It wasn't, and the reasons the exam boards want you to understand. The Royal Society initially rejected Jenner's paper. Doctors who made good money from the older, riskier inoculation method had a financial reason to resist a cheaper rival treatment. Religious objectors called vaccination unnatural, or even blasphemous, for deliberately putting animal matter into a human body. Popular cartoons of the time mocked patients supposedly sprouting cow-like features after the injection. And working-class communities frequently resented and resisted government orders to vaccinate their children, seeing it as unwanted state interference in their private lives, a tension that would echo through public health debates for the next 2 centuries. Despite the resistance, the results were undeniable, and the government eventually acted. Vaccination against smallpox became compulsory in Britain in 1853. It stands as the first ever vaccine, and ultimately, in the 20th century, the method would achieve something medicine had never done before: the total, worldwide eradication of a human disease. The Industrial Revolution dragged millions of people from the countryside into rapidly growing cities, and those cities were, in exam terms, a public health catastrophe. Overcrowded slum housing, no sewage systems, drinking water routinely contaminated by human waste, streets that simply were not designed for the numbers of people now crammed into them. Into these conditions arrived cholera, first striking Britain in 1831, a horrific disease that could kill a healthy adult within hours through catastrophic diarrhea and dehydration. And doctors had two rival, competing explanations for why it spread, which the exam boards test constantly. The dominant theory was still miasma, bad, corrupted air causing disease. A smaller, initially mocked group argued for contagion, that something was being passed directly between people or through contaminated water. In 1854, the physician John Snow mapped cholera deaths clustering tightly around a single water pump on Broad Street in Soho, London, and traced the outbreak directly to sewage-contaminated water, not bad air at all. He removed the pump handle. Deaths in that area stopped. Edwin Chadwick, a civil servant rather than a doctor, published a devastating report in 1842 proving, with hard statistics, a direct link between poverty, filthy living conditions, and shortened life expectancy. It shocked Parliament into its first real action. The Public Health Act of 1848 allowed local authorities to set up local boards of health, appoint medical officers, and improve sewers and drainage. But mark that word carefully: allowed, not required. Many towns, reluctant to raise local taxes, simply chose not to bother, and the act had no real teeth to force them. Real, lasting change didn't arrive until 1875, when a second, far tougher Public Health Act made these measures compulsory for every local authority. Clean water, proper sewage disposal, appointed medical officers, all now required by law, not optional extras. By the 1870s, John Snow's water-based explanation for cholera was also finally gaining wider acceptance. Government had learned, slowly and expensively, that public health required government power, not just good intentions from individual reformers. In 1861, the French scientist Louis Pasteur published germ theory, and it answered the single biggest question in the entire history of medicine: what actually causes disease? Investigating why wine and milk soured, Pasteur proved that microorganisms, invisible living things too small to see without a microscope, caused fermentation and decay, and, crucially, that these same tiny organisms could cause disease in the human body too. This single idea instantly explained everything that miasma theory never could. Why disease spread from sick people to healthy ones, why washing your hands mattered, why boiling instruments might save a life. It also, quietly, closed the loop that had been open since Vesalius and Harvey 3 centuries earlier. Now doctors finally had both accurate anatomy and an actual cause of disease. But Pasteur's theory on its own still couldn't cure anything. It couldn't yet tell you which specific germ caused which specific disease, or how to stop that particular germ. That precise, disease-by-disease detective work fell to a German doctor named Robert Koch. Robert Koch took Pasteur's general theory and made it specific, and specific is what makes a theory actually useful to a doctor. Using improved microscopes, new staining techniques to make bacteria visible, and rigorous, careful laboratory method, Koch identified the exact bacterium responsible for tuberculosis in 1882, then cholera in 1883, diseases that had killed millions across Britain for generations. He and his students went on to identify the specific germs behind typhoid, diphtheria, and tetanus within the following 2 decades, in what historians call the Golden Age of bacteriology, a period of rapid, cascading discovery as scientists across Europe raced to identify one deadly germ after another. This mattered enormously in practice. Once you know exactly which germ causes a specific disease, you can start hunting deliberately and scientifically for something that kills that germ specifically, rather than guessing. Germ theory had explained the problem. Koch's method now gave doctors an actual, precise target to aim medicine at, disease by disease, and the search for cures could finally begin in earnest. Before the 1840s, surgery meant being held down, fully conscious, while a surgeon worked as fast as humanly possible because speed was the only mercy available. Patients often died purely from the agony and shock of the operation itself, regardless of how skilled the surgeon's hands were. Nitrous oxide and ether offered partial relief from the 1840s onward, but both came with serious drawbacks: Ether was unpleasantly irritating to breathe and dangerously flammable in a room lit by candles. In 1847, the Scottish obstetrician James Simpson experimented on himself and his dinner guests, testing chemical compounds until he found chloroform, which knocked them all unconscious around the table. Chloroform proved far more effective and pleasant than its predecessors, and adoption accelerated dramatically after 1853, when Queen Victoria herself used it during childbirth, a royal endorsement that silenced most remaining religious objectors overnight. But anesthetics created an unexpected, deadly new problem the exam board specifically test. Unconscious patients allowed surgeons to operate for far longer and go far deeper into the body than ever before. And going deeper, without any concept of germs, simply meant far more patients now died afterwards, of raging infection. Joseph Lister, a surgeon working in Glasgow, read Pasteur's germ theory and made the connection nobody else had quite made. If invisible germs caused infection, then killing those germs during surgery should prevent it. In 1865, he began soaking surgical dressings and spraying the air of the operating theater with carbolic acid, a harsh chemical already used to treat sewage, to kill germs before they could infect an open wound. The results, carefully measured and published, were dramatic and undeniable. Surgical death rates on his wards fell from around 45% to roughly 15%. Yet Lister faced real resistance too. Many surgeons found the method impractical and unpleasant. The acrid carbolic spray stung eyes and cracked skin, and some doctors were simply reluctant to believe that invisible creatures they had never personally seen could really be responsible for killing their patients. It took roughly 2 decades for antiseptic surgery to become standard British practice, evolving eventually into full asepsis, sterilizing the entire environment before surgery even began, rather than just spraying chemicals during it. Anaesthetics had made deep surgery possible. Lister, finally, made it survivable. Florence Nightingale transformed nursing from an unskilled, low-status role into a respected, trained profession, and the crisis that made her name was the Crimean War. Arriving at the British military hospital at Scutari in 1854, she found conditions almost worse than the battlefield. Filthy wards, contaminated water, overwhelming overcrowding, and far more soldiers dying from disease in the hospital itself than from wounds sustained in combat. Nightingale enforced strict hygiene, proper ventilation, clean water, and better nutrition, and death rates on her wards fell steeply within months. Crucially, she also gathered and presented careful statistical evidence, using striking visual charts to prove her improvements had actually saved lives, an early and effective use of data to drive medical reform. Returning home a national celebrity, she used that fame and influence to found a proper nursing school at St. Thomas' Hospital in London in 1860, establishing formal training standards that professionalized nursing across the country and, eventually, well beyond Britain. Note carefully, she worked before germ theory existed, driven by cleanliness and instinct, not yet a full scientific understanding of exactly why it worked. In 1895, the German physicist Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays almost entirely by accident, while experimenting with electrical currents passed through a sealed glass tube. He noticed the rays could pass straight through soft human tissue while being blocked by denser bone, producing, for the very first time in human history, an image of the inside of a living body without any need to cut it open at all. The medical implications were immediate and transformative. Doctors could now locate a broken bone precisely, or find a lodged bullet, without exploratory surgery, and diagnosis itself began shifting from educated guesswork based on external symptoms towards genuine, direct internal evidence. X-ray technology reached British hospitals within just a few short years, remarkably fast diffusion for the period, and it marks a turning point examiners frequently highlight. The moment technology, not new theory, started driving major medical progress. From this point onward, medical history increasingly becomes the story of new machines, new chemicals, and new equipment, working alongside scientific theory rather than following behind it, each pushing the other forward. Now doctors knew, thanks to Koch, precisely which germs caused which diseases. The next question was harder. Could you design a chemical that killed a specific germ inside the human body, without also poisoning the patient carrying it? The German scientist Paul Ehrlich called this ambition the magic bullet, a compound that would hunt down and destroy one target with precision and leave everything else in the body untouched. Ehrlich's laboratory tested compound after compound against syphilis, a serious and widespread bacterial disease, in a slow, grueling, and often demoralizing process of systematic trial and error. Compound number 606 finally worked in 1909, and Ehrlich marketed it as Salvarsan, the world's first true magic bullet and the first drug specifically designed, from the ground up, to target one particular disease-causing germ. It proved that the concept was genuinely possible, not just theoretical. But magic bullets like Salvarsan still worked against only the one specific disease they'd been painstakingly built for. The dream of one all-purpose drug that could kill many different infections at once still felt impossibly far away. In September 1928, Alexander Fleming returned from a holiday to his cluttered London laboratory and noticed something odd in a stack of petri dishes he'd carelessly left unwashed. One dish, contaminated by an airborne mold, had a clear ring around it where bacteria simply refused to grow. The mold, penicillium, was somehow killing the surrounding bacteria outright. Fleming correctly identified the antibacterial substance and named it penicillin, and he published his modest findings the following year, in 1929. And then almost nothing happened for over a decade. Fleming lacked the chemistry skills and, crucially, the funding to purify penicillin into a usable, stable medicine, and his relatively low-key published paper attracted little serious attention from the wider scientific community at the time. It's a detail the exam boards specifically want you to know, because it complicates the neat, simple story of a single genius solving everything. Chance, dirty laboratory habits, and sheer accident played a real and undeniable role in this discovery. But an accidental discovery, sitting quietly in a scientific journal nobody had read closely, still isn't a working medicine that can save a single life. It took Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, working together at Oxford University a full decade later, to turn Fleming's accidental observation into something a doctor could actually prescribe. Their small research team painstakingly purified penicillin and, in 1941, successfully tested it on a human patient for the very first time, a police officer named Albert Alexander, dying from a severe infection, who improved dramatically before the researchers tragically ran out of the tiny quantity of the drug they'd managed to produce, and he relapsed and died. The war then transformed everything about the drug's future almost overnight. With Britain fighting for survival and wounded soldiers dying from infected battle wounds by the thousand, the British and American governments funded and organized mass industrial production of penicillin at a scale nobody could have imagined a decade earlier. By D-Day in 1944, penicillin was available in genuinely significant quantities for treating Allied troops on the front line. This is the exam pattern to remember clearly: an individual's accidental discovery, followed by years of underfunded stagnation, followed by rapid, government and war-funded mass development.
Chance started it.
War finished it. Before 1948, healthcare in Britain depended heavily on what you could afford to pay for it, a system that left the poorest either going without treatment entirely or relying on patchy, inconsistent charity care that varied wildly from town to town. Aneurin Bevan, Minister of Health in the post-war Labour government, drove through arguably the single biggest change in the entire history of British medicine. The National Health Service, launched on the 5th of July 1948, offering treatment that was, in Bevan's own defining phrase, free at the point of use, funded collectively through general taxation rather than by individual patients paying for what they personally needed. For the very first time in British history, seeing a doctor, having surgery, or getting essential medicine no longer depended primarily on how much money you happened to have in your pocket. It represented a fundamental shift in how an entire nation collectively thought about health, not a private, individual expense to be managed alone, but a shared public right that the whole of society funded together, for everyone, regardless of their income. The National Health Service was nowhere near as uncontroversial at the time as it can feel looking back from today. In January 1948, just months before launch, 84% of doctors in the British Medical Association actually voted against joining Bevan's new scheme, fearing they would be reduced from independent, well-paid professionals into salaried employees of central government, effectively civil servants rather than private practitioners running their own practice. Bevan eventually won enough of the medical profession over through a pragmatic compromise, allowing hospital consultants to keep treating lucrative private patients on the side, even while also working within the new public system, a deal he later described, with some frustration, as having stuffed doctors' mouths with gold to secure their cooperation. Despite all that bitter resistance right up to the very last moment, 95% of the entire British population had voluntarily registered with the new NHS before its official opening day. It proved that dramatic, society-wide medical change increasingly required organized government funding and political willpower, not just brilliant individual scientific breakthroughs working alone in a laboratory. In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick, working at Cambridge University, described the double helix structure of DNA, the molecule that carries the complete genetic instructions for every single living thing on Earth. Their breakthrough relied heavily on X-ray diffraction images produced by Rosalind Franklin, a chemist at King's College London whose crucial photographic evidence was used, controversially, and without her full knowledge or consent at the time, to help confirm the final structure, a contribution only properly and widely credited many decades later. Understanding DNA's structure eventually unlocked genetic medicine entirely, identifying which specific genes cause particular inherited diseases, understanding precisely why some people are more vulnerable to certain conditions than others, and, much more recently, genuinely editing faulty genes directly to treat or even fully prevent some hereditary diseases before symptoms ever appear. It represents the sharpest possible contrast with where this whole story began, from a medieval physician squinting at the color of urine in a glass, guessing at an imbalance of mysterious bodily fluids, to scientists reading the literal, precise genetic code written inside every single human cell. Modern medicine has kept building steadily on every single layer this video has covered. CT and MRI scanners now let doctors see detailed cross-sections deep inside a living body, extending Röntgen's original X-ray breakthrough far beyond what he could ever have imagined. Keyhole surgery uses tiny cameras and precision instruments through small incisions, dramatically reducing both infection risk and lengthy recovery time, a direct descendant of Lister's original antiseptic principles applied with modern engineering. Robotic-assisted surgery now allows surgeons steadier, more precise control than the human hand alone can reliably manage. And genetic engineering, building directly on Watson, Crick, and Franklin's DNA discovery, can already correct certain single-gene disorders, with much more on the horizon as the underlying technology continues to mature and improve. Government funding, international scientific collaboration, and rapid communication of new research findings now drive medical progress at a pace no lone genius working in isolation could ever hope to match by themselves. The core underlying question, though, genuinely has not changed at all since 1250. What is actually making this person sick, and precisely how do we stop it? Only the tools available have transformed completely. So across 750 years, what actually drove medical change, and what held it back? This is the exact evaluation question every exam board eventually asks, so build your own list. Individual genius clearly mattered. Jenner, Pasteur, Fleming, Watson, and Crick each made a genuine, identifiable breakthrough. But so did pure chance. Fleming's unwashed petri dish, Jenner overhearing local dairy farmyard folklore about milkmaids. War mattered enormously too. Penicillin only reached mass production because of the Second World War's industrial urgency and funding. Government action mattered just as much. The Public Health Acts and the NHS itself needed political willpower and state power, not just brilliant scientific ideas sitting unused in a journal. Technology mattered. X-rays, microscopes, and scanners each opened doors that pure theory alone simply could not open on its own. And religion and superstition held medicine back for centuries, right alongside the church also preserving and copying ancient medical texts that would otherwise have been permanently lost. No single factor explains this whole story on its own. Every single one of them does, working together in different proportions, in every single era. That is medicine through time, the whole 750-year arc every exam board expects you to know. The Four Humours, the Black Death, Vesalius and Harvey correcting Galen without curing anyone, Jenner's vaccine working before anyone knew why, Pasteur and Koch finally explaining the cause, Lister and Nightingale making hospitals survivable, Fleming's lucky accident turned into mass-produced medicine by a war, and Bevan's NHS making all of it free for everyone at the point of use. If you remember one framework walking into that exam hall, remember this: Causes, prevention, treatment, and public health, changing at completely different speeds, pushed forward by science, chance, war, government, and individuals, and held back by religion, money, and simple, stubborn resistance to change. This video is part of our GCSE History playlist, one full video for every topic on every exam board. Weimar and Nazi Germany and the Cold War are already up, this makes 3. Subscribe, follow the playlist through every remaining topic, and good luck in that exam hall. You now know this story better than most adults ever will.